Hey guys, Pastor Ben here with another review and reflection. Today I want to talk about a book I just finished reading by Grace Olmstead called Uprooted, Recovering the Legacy of the Places We've Left Behind. This book came out just a year or two ago, I believe. It was published in 2021, so a very recent book, written by a woman who is a journalist living outside of D.C. now, but who is from a small town called Emmett, Idaho. And this book is a really interesting exploration of her own story of moving from a rural farming area in the United States to outside of D.C., one of the great urban centers of our country and of the world in a sense, and just tracing how that move happened for her and some of the tensions that she has experienced coming from a rural background into an urban context and leaving the place where she grew up behind, and just wrestling with, is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? What are the differences between those rural and urban communities, places that people think of as being very important, like Washington, D.C., and places that people probably don't think about at all, like Emmett, Idaho. And so this book is an exploration of her own story, but she uses that as a journalist to explore the stories and experiences of communities really all across the United States that are similarly viewed as being, flyover country, and just unpacking some of the issues of urbanization, agricultural policy and development, and so forth. And so it raises a lot of really interesting questions, which I'll talk about in a moment. Part of what prompted my interest in this book was not only the themes that it develops, which are ones that are of great interest to me, but also I had the chance to go to school very briefly with the author, Grace Olmstead. We overlapped for just about a year at Patrick Henry College here in Northern Virginia. So it was very interesting to see a classmate publishing a book, and I was curious to read it. A member of my congregation owned it and was willing to loan me a copy. I'm very grateful for that. I was able to read it over Christmas. So let me tell you a little bit about this book, some of the strengths and weaknesses, and who might find it interesting. So this book is broken down into 11 chapters. It's just about a 200-ish page book. A very, in a sense, easy read. Grace writes as a journalist. She's a very good writer. She's written for a number of publications, kind of across the spectrum. And so she's able to bring those skills to bear in writing this book, Uprooted. While it is an easy read, it is definitely one that will be challenging to the reader. Not in the sense of being a difficult book to read, but in the sense that it is raising a lot of kind of uncomfortable questions. As I mentioned at the beginning of this review, this book is exploring the dynamic which has been taking place in America for more than a century now, but has just been accelerating the further we've gone, of the center of American life shifting from small towns and rural communities and family farms to increasing urbanization. So what that means is more people are moving into the cities, more people are growing up never knowing anything except an urban city environment. And when you go to rural communities, what you often find is that even if the same number of acres, or maybe even more acres, are being farmed in some cases, what you have are fewer and fewer farms. And the kind of farming that is taking place is fundamentally different than the farming that existed, of course, prior to the Industrial Revolution, but even in America after the Industrial Revolution, let's say from the mid-1800s to the mid-1900s. And what that has meant for many of the communities and the small towns that were centered on rural agricultural farming life is some fundamental shifts in what their life, what their community looks like. And Grace Olmstead is tracing those changes and developments in her book. Now, as I said, this is a very personal book for her. It really grew out of her own experience of growing up in a small town, moving towards a big city, moving into academia, being kind of the bright, successful person, and looking for greener pastures beyond her own small town life. But part of her experience was, as she made that move to the big city, to bigger things, to important things as they're defined by our culture, was she began to have a greater appreciation for the life she had left behind in her small town of Emmett. And she talks about her own experience, but even beyond that, she has a lot of attention to her grandfather, who farmed in the Treasure Valley there in Idaho for his whole life, was a big part of the community there, and had a lot of deep roots. And I think one of the strengths of this book is that it's written with a personal eye. Sometimes when you get people writing about these things, and this pops up in both kind of sides of the question. Some people view the move towards urbanization and industrialization and technologically driven economies as just an unmitigated good. You know, kind of a lot of libertarian types will view things that way. Hey, people make more money, goods are cheaper, food costs less. You know, these are good things. You know, and anyone who wants to point out challenges or problems that have emerged from this are just kind of, you know, naively nostalgic, looking for a past that never existed, and unrealistically thinking that life is just better back on the farm. You know, that's kind of one view, because there's no real experience with these communities. There's no real experience with farming and agricultural practices. Some of the things that are important in terms of, you know, not just the quantity of food we're able to produce, but the quality of food and so forth, is not really on the radar screen. And so you can kind of end up with a somewhat detached view that just says, yes, urbanization, industrialization, these are all unmitigated good things. On the other side of the spectrum, what you will find on, you know, many blogs and a number of books and things are people who, again, probably don't really understand the pressures and challenges of you know, running a family farm, of living in a small town, of committing yourself to a particular way of life in a particular place. And so there is kind of this naive, nostalgic, you know, bucolic picture painted where, you know, everything is like a Thomas Kincaid painting, and if we could just, you know, get rid of our phones and get rid of technology and get back to the land, everything would be wonderful, everything would be beautiful. And what that misses, of course, is that there were real pressures, real opportunities, real challenges that moved America from a country of largely small family farms to the model of not only farming but you know, economic model and so forth that we have today. You can critique that, but you need to understand why that happened and what it's actually like to stay put and not move into the city or move towards bigger or better things, kind of speaking. And so what I think Grace Olmstead brings to the table is that when she's writing about the strengths and weaknesses of small town farming life, she's doing that from the perspective of someone who has lived it, someone who has been there. But also, as she is critiquing what agricultural and economic policies and just cultural values in general have done to small town life, she's doing that as someone who's lived it, who's experienced the good and the bad that is there. And so that personal element gives her a unique vantage point, and her journalistic training allows her to not just kind of give you a book that's full of anecdotes and stories, there's something compelling and interesting about that, but to connect it with what's going on economically, what's going on at a policy level, what are the cultural shifts that have gone on, and just broadening the anecdotes by bringing in statistical analysis of, you know, how many family farms are there, how much food is being produced, you know, what are the wages like, so on and so forth. So what that produces is a book that I found to be wonderfully kind of balanced, meaning if you're someone who loves the family farm and just wants to go back to that small town life, you're going to find things in this book that are really going to be encouraging and inspiring to you, and a lot that you like. There are also going to be some hard questions raised that are going to probably make you think about, okay, what are the obstacles to that way of life? What are the challenges to that way of life? What are the costs to that way of life? Similarly, if you are the kind of libertarian type who just says, yeah, you know, it's no problem if these small towns are dying, people are moving to the city because they want to live in the city, that's just a good thing, we shouldn't try to fight it, we shouldn't try to do anything for those small communities, or we shouldn't try to prioritize small farms, bigger is better, get big or get out, as the Department of Agriculture said back in the 70s. No problems. Well, then this book is going to have a lot that challenges you, a lot that you have to think about as you actually think about the implications of those policies for real people in real places and at real times. And one of the kinds of things that Olmstead argues is that what we have sort of in essence done is turned the Midwestern and farming and rural parts of our country into colonies of the larger urban areas. In other words, largely what we end up doing is, for the sake of having cheaper food and greater access to things in our cities, we end up leeching the life away from small towns, small communities, small farms, and rural areas. And so places that were once very vibrant are often kind of dying on the vine, or have already died. And she wants to alert us to that fact, and to say that as we think about the implications of our policies, what we want as a society, what a good life looks like, what success should mean, we have to broaden the story beyond just an individual, right? And beyond just price point markers, as important as those are, right? We live in an age where we're feeling a lot of inflation, and when things cost more at the grocery store, we all feel that. But there are hidden costs to cheap food and so forth that are often not factored in and need to be in some way. And there are different policy ways you could do that, but it's a conversation you need to have, and they're problems that you have to grapple with. So this book, I think, will help people across the political spectrum, whether you're from a rural area or an urban area, whether you have stayed put in your kind of hometown or have moved on to something else. It's going to give you something to think about no matter where you land on that. Now let me just speak to one more issue before I wrap up this review. So as I was reading other people's thoughts on the book, everybody agreed it was well written, everybody agreed it had interesting ideas. A number of people, though, critiqued the book because they said it felt like, as she was kind of grappling with this, should I stay in the DC area where I've put down roots and gotten married and had kids, or should I move back to the small town? Should I go back home and be one of those people who sticks and who stays? As she wrestles with that feeling of being uprooted, a number of people critiqued her for not having a really clear, here's the conclusion, here's the answer to her book. And they said it felt like she was just kind of circling around that issue again and again, and there was this kind of repetition, and then in the end, it was somewhat of an ambiguous conclusion. And people didn't like that. They wanted to see a more clear picking of sides, as it were. Either, yes, go with the new urban, or yes, go back to the old, small, local family farm kind of thing. I think that's the strength of the book, is that you read it, and you read someone who is very intelligent, who has personal experience with these things, who is genuinely wrestling. And I think the book is an invitation for us to wrestle with these things, no matter what our experience is. Had it simply said, yes, everyone, go back to the closest thing to home that you know and just stay there and don't ever leave, that would appeal to some people, but it would not be getting us thinking for many others. Similarly, if it simply rejected the hometown and said, hey, just move to the new city, make as much money as you can, and make that the goal of your life, again, some people would grab hold of that, but it doesn't speak to everyone. I think the strength of this book is that it is personal, but it broadens that personal lens to take in the statistics and the trends and the policy dynamics and questions. And it does so in a way that genuinely wrestles with the complexities on both sides. If you are someone who has read agrarian writers like Wendell Berry, you're going to find a lot here that you resonate with and you like. But I think she does a good job of anticipating some of the challenges and objections people have, and of forcing us to kind of wrestle with those things. So it's not the kind of book that you walk away with and say, I agreed with the book or I didn't agree with the book. I don't think that's really her goal. I think her goal is to force us to grapple with some of these questions and issues that are often not spoken about, and to push us to really wrestle with the complexities they involve. So, for all those reasons, I would highly recommend this book by Grace Olmstead, Uprooted, Recovering the Legacy of the Places We've Left Behind.